We start at Watergate, and that is me in 1982 outside the Watergate Hotel. And my wife was at the Kennedy Center at that place, roughly, not quite the time that the Watergate break-in took place, which was 1972. Oh, it was a toilet paper shortage in 1973. Did you know that? Yeah, this guy was responsible, Johnny Carson, for the toilet paper shortage. Here are the plumbers, the guys who broke into the Watergate Hotel. On January 8th, 1973, the Watergate break-in trial begins. The accused are Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Baker, James McCord, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. Lyndon Johnson dies around that time as well. On January 18th, 1973, he suffered a heart attack and succumbed. Nixon's second term begins on January 20th, 1973. And there was Pat Nixon looking admiringly at Richard Nixon. And I hope Nixon paid for that coat, because in 1952, he was accused of not taking gifts, one of them a coat. January 2nd, Richard Nixon is sworn in for a second term as president. Spiro Agnew sworn in for a second term as vice president. Roe versus Wade is also decided very early in Nixon's second term. It's January 22nd. In the case of Roe versus Wade, 410 U.S. 113, 7-2 decision. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. Vietnam is about ready to come to an end for the Americans. The peace talks broke down in Paris in December of 1972. Their strategy starting December 13th, 1972. After the talks break down, let's bomb the hell out of North Vietnam. And that's what happened, the new plan. On December 18th, 1972, 5 days after the breakdown in peace talks, Richard Nixon announces the start of Christmas bombing of North Vietnam. American B-52s and fighter bombers dropped 20,000 tons of bombs on the city of Hanoi and Haiphong. The United States lost 15 of its giant B-52s, 11 other aircrafts during the attacks. North Vietnam claimed that 1,600 civilians were killed. The bombings ended on December 29th, 1972. The North Vietnamese decided, let's go back to the bargaining table in Paris and see what we could do. And it was back to Paris. And eventually, a couple weeks later, the war is over. The peace treaty is signed. Now, like I said, I knew Nixon. He's a very, very strange guy. Smart guy, but very paranoid. And he's the only president of the United States who had his re-election committee called CREEP, C-R-E-E-P, Committee for the Re-election of the President. What president in his right mind would allow his re-election campaign to be called CREEP? But that's what it was. It was called CREEP. Now, the 72 election, Nixon was very worried about Edmund Muskie, not George McGovern. He thought Muskie was the guy that he had to beat. So they set up a dirty tricks campaign against him. The Vietnam War in 1972 was continuing. The American economy was a mess. In the midterms, Democrats won the popular vote in House races by 8.7%, added a dozen seats. In 1971, Nixon's approval ratings dropped below 50%. So there was some question, at least in his mind and his advisor's mind, whether or not he would be reelected in 1972. Oh, that's his autograph. And one of the strangest things about it, it looks like it's on the line, right? Look at the autograph. It looks like it's on the line. Well, it is on the line. He pulled out a little ruler. I have an index card. And he put the index card against the side of the table, put the ruler on it, signed his name, and then X'd the X. Really, really strange when I saw that, but that's that. And also, I used to see him quite a bit, and I would say to him, "Oh, Mr. President, how you doing?" He said, no, Evan, call me Dick." Hi, Dick. And that's the way it always was. Call me Dick. Oh, that's a Larry O'Brien basketball that sits in my basement. It was given to me as a Christmas present by the National Basketball Association in 1981. Larry O'Brien was the commissioner of the NBA. He was brought into the NBA in the mid-1970s to hammer out a merger with the American Basketball Association. The NBA owners figured he was Lyndon Johnson's liaison to Congress. He was also the head of the Democratic National Committee, and they could get a merger done. Never happened, but the ABA absorbed the NBA absorbed 4 ABA teams in there. And I once said to Larry O'Brien, "Why your office?" He said, "They thought I had all the information." It was Larry O'Brien's office that was broken into at the Watergate Hotel. So it's fascinating to me that I got to know Nixon and Larry O'Brien. I didn't get to know this guy, but he was in my business, E. Gordon Liddy. In January 1972, he's the general counsel, creep. It's a creep. And he says, "Hey, why don't we burglarize and wiretap the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., particularly Larry O'Brien's office." Sounds like a good idea, right? Let's do it. And there is Larry, who was part of the Kennedy Irish Mafia during the Kennedy administration. Him, Kenny O'Donnell, Powers, Pierre Salinger, who wasn't Irish, Ted Sorensen, who wasn't Irish, but it was the Irish Mafia during the John F. Kennedy days, these guys from Boston. So it's May 17th, 1972, and wiretaps are placed on the telephones of the Democratic National Committee Chairman, Lawrence O'Brien, and the Executive Director of the Democratic States Chairman, R. Spencer Oliver Jr. On June 17th, Frank Wells, a security guard at the Watergate complex, called police at about 1:30 in the morning, and 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee's headquarters office. They would be known as the Plumbers, and the Plumbers first struck in 1971. I don't know if you remember Daniel Ellsberg, because the book is probably upstairs, the Pentagon Papers. Well, the Plumbers were there to create leaks and plug leaks. And they decided that Ellsberg, because of the Pentagon Papers, was a really bad risk, and they had to basically discredit him. So they put together the Plumbers and broke into his psychiatrist's office, hoping to get papers on Ellsberg's mental health. So January 8th, the Plumbers, Gonzalez, Parker, McCord, Martinez, Sturgis, they're charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of telephone and other communications. So there are 2 guys who are pretty marginal at the Washington Post. One's an egghead and one's a guy who never went to college. The egghead sat there, Bob Woodward, and thought about things. The other guy, Carl Bernstein, was a police reporter. And I was a police reporter. You don't think when you're a police reporter, you just report. There's nothing that says, maybe I should think about that sentence. And they were perfect together because Woodward took a long time to figure stuff out. And Bernstein, well, he shortened that. And Bernstein basically flew off the handle. So they're the reporters. And this is a police case. Bernstein and Woodward on June 19th revealed that one of the Watergate burglars, James McCourt, was a Republican Party security aide. How would they know that? Because Bernstein worked the streets. Woodward didn't, but Bernstein was, one of these leather guys on the streets. And there is James McCourt. The reporting in June and July, Woodward and Bernstein have a source. Deep Throat. Mark Felt eventually would come out. He was Deep Throat, and he says to them, examine the burglars' accounts, follow the money, and see how it connects to CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president, through its subordinate finance committee. Now, the candidates in 1972 were me, Nixon, and George McGovern. Well, I never understood McGovern was sort of a war hero flyer, and Nixon really didn't do anything in World War II, except McGovern was tarred and feathered with the protesters by Nixon, but Nixon really didn't see action in World War II, whereas McGovern did. The campaign, there he is on the stump. On August 29th, 1972, he's running for re-election, and he's at the White House, and he says, I can categorically deny that no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed was involved in this very bizarre incident. Oh, call me Dick. On August 30th, 1972, Nixon announces that the White House counsel, John Dean, has completed an internal investigation into the Watergate breakdown, and guess what? We didn't do it. Well, who did? Wasn't us. These guys are still digging up the dirt. Look at Bernstein's hair in those days. Woodward looks like a little kid, doesn't he? They're still digging up. September 29th, 1972, the Washington Post reports that Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, once controlled a secret fund to finance intelligence gathering against the Democrats. Now, Bernstein, again, the police reporter, he would do something like this. He calls Mitchell for a comment. Mitchell threatens both Bernstein and Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post. The Post prints the threat. The heroes in the Watergate story, additionally to Bernstein and Woodward, are Katharine Graham, who's the publisher of the Post, and Ben Bradley, the editor. They gave Bernstein and Woodward carte blanche. I'm not sure that would have happened if it was a guy who was likable, but I don't know if you remember Herb Bloch, who was a cartoonist during that time. About 6 years ago, I'm a member of the New York Press Club, and that's actually a good video for you to get. It was called Herb Bloch, and Herb Bloch started doing cartoons, anti-Nixon cartoons, in the early 1950s when he was a congressman, then vice president. And I was watching the video, and apparently Woodward said, Herb Bloch came up to him, he said, guys, you're doing a fantastic job. Keep it up. And Woodward says in that DVD that when he heard that from Herb Bloch, they knew they were on the right path. The guy they wanted to get was the Maine Senator, Muskie. In October 1972, Woodward and Bernstein report that the FBI made some connections between Nixon's aides and the Watergate break-in. Woodward and Bernstein described the existence of a major dirty tricks campaign conducted against Muskie, orchestrated by Donald Segretti and Creep, and Nixon's private attorney. Nixon would win on November 7th, 1972, even though Watergate's hanging over him. He wins 49 of 50 states, gets 520 electoral votes, gets 61% of the popular vote, and beats McGovern by 18 million votes. So he should be in the clear in 1973. He should be in the clear. Now, the mandate. He has a mandate. But there are storm clouds brewing. For two of the plumbers, James McCourt and Gonzalez. On January 8th, the trial begins. The 5 defendants plead guilty. Linney and McCourt are convicted after the trial. The FBI director is L. Patrick Gray. And L. Patrick Gray becomes very problematic for Nixon. On February 28th, the acting FBI director, L. Patrick Gray, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee during his nomination to replace J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI. Armed with newspaper articles indicating the White House had possession of FBI Watergate files, the committee chairman, the Democrat Sam Ervin, questioned Gray as to what he knew about the White House obtaining the FBI files. And that is Sam Ervin. Gray stated he had given the FBI reports to John Dean, and he discussed the FBI investigation with Dean on many occasions. It also came out that Gray had destroyed important evidence entrusted to him by Dean. Needless to say, Patrick Gray never became the director of the FBI. Gray's nomination failed. Dean was directly linked to the Watergate cover-up. And there is, on March 19th, the letter to the judge, John J. Sirica, who was a Republican appointee, James McCourt says the defendants were pressured to plead guilty and remain silent, that perjury was committed and that others were involved. McCourt stated that his plea and testimony were compelled by pressure from the White House counsel, John Dean, and the former Attorney General, John N. Mitchell. And there is Liddy. On March 23rd, the 5 Watergate burglars, along with Liddy and Hunt, were sentenced with stiff fines and maximum prison time of up to 40 years. Camp David is in Maryland. It's named after Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, David Eisenhower, who happened to marry Julie Eisenhower, and they lived on the main line in Philadelphia, off the main line in Philadelphia, Society Hill. And that's how there is where my connection with Nixon is. So that's Camp David. It's in Maryland. It was a hideaway built for Dwight Eisenhower. And on March 22nd, Nixon calls John Dean into the office. Put together a report with everything you know about the Watergate matter. And he said, let's go up to Camp David together to do this. So Dean goes to Camp David, starts working on his report, and he begins to realize, you know what? There's a problem here. I'm incriminating myself. Dean concluded he was being fitted for the role of scapegoats by higher-ups. He does not finish the report, and there is John Dean. On April 6th, he hires an attorney and begins to cooperate with Senate Watergate investigators while continuing his work. So he's a double agent at this point as Nixon's chief White House counsel and participate in cover-up efforts. But he doesn't discuss or does not disclose to Nixon that he's doing this. And Nixon probably would have gotten really upset if he found out. So Dean continues to provide information for prosecutors who all of a sudden are making enormous progress on the cover-up. Things that they ignored, all of a sudden they had evidence of. And they started to concentrate on the actual burglary and the events that preceded it, which goes back to Ellsberg's psychiatrist in 1971 and the dress rehearsal for the break-in of the Watergate hotel. And there is Haldeman to the left, Ehrlichman to the right. Dean asked Nixon for formal immunity for prosecution for any crimes that he may have committed while serving as the White House counsel. No, not doing it. And Dean said, okay, he's leaving me out to hang. I'm going to show him. And he cooperates. Again, John Dean. On April 19th, Dean served notice. He's not going to be the scapegoat for the Watergate scandal. Word was also passed by associates of Dean that he was ready to implicate Ehrlichman and Haldeman in the case. He decides he's going to fire everybody. Nixon. On April 30th, White House announces the resignation of the Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, along with John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman, and they fired John Dean. Nixon said after accepting the resignation of the 4 close aides that he accepted full responsibility for the actions of his subordinates in the Watergate scandal. So it wasn't as bizarre as Nixon originally pointed out, was it? I solemnly swear to tell the truth. June 25th, John Dean began his testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee. The committee had voted to grant him use immunity. In his testimony, he implicated a number of administration officials, including the Nixon fundraiser and former Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon, and himself. I had a lot of tape recorders in my life, but I didn't have that particular tape recorder. There's nothing special about that tape recorder, except it's part of American history. Nixon decided to get some tape recorders to record things in the Oval Office, record things in Camp David. It's about a $50 tape recorder. Could pick up phone conversations, pick up conversations in the room. Like I said, there is really nothing special about that tape recorder. In February 1971, a sound-activated taping system was installed in the Oval Office, and including in Nixon's Oval Office desk to capture audio transmitted by telephone taps in concealed microphones. The system was expanded to include other rooms within the White House, along with Camp David. The taping system was confirmed by the Senate staff member Donald Sanders on July 13th in an interview with White House aide Alexander Butterfield. And there is Butterfield, who's still around today. 3 days later, it was made public during the televised testimony of Butterfield when he was asked about the possibility of a White House taping system by Senate counsel Fred Thompson, the same Fred Thompson who was an actor well, I forgot what, he was in a police show, wasn't he? I forgot which one. He was also a senator at one point from Tennessee. This is the original tape recorder. Nothing special. That's the way it looked in those days. Had the reel, and just set it up, looped it. Wasn't a cassette, and that tape recorder made history. On July 26th, the committee subpoenaed several White House tapes after the president said, "I'm not giving them to you." The accuracy of Dean's testimony was confirmed by the tapes, the very tapes that Richard Nixon commissioned. Archibald Cox was brought in as the special prosecutor, Harvard law professor, to investigate the Watergate break-in. Nixon's refusal to release over 10 hours of secret Oval Office recordings, some of which implicated the president in the breakout, would cause all kinds of fighting. Let me say this about that. Let me make this perfectly clear. October 20th, 1973 becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon fired Cox, accepted the resignation of the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus. There is Richardson and there is Ruckelshaus. On that evening, Nixon was looking for somebody to fire Cox. Richardson said, not me, man. I'm out of here. The deputy, Ruckelshaus, hey, I'm not going to do this. I'm gone. I won a good job in Washington afterwards. That left a guy by the name of Robert Bork. Remember Robert Bork, who never got to the Supreme Court? Well, the Solicitor General is the highest ranking official in the Justice Department. Bork was the guy who fired Richard Nixon. And there he is. He's also a character in The Simpsons. If you've ever watched The Simpsons, there is a drawing of Robert Bork. They don't call him Robert Bork, but he's part of The Simpsons. The reaction to the firing and resignations would force Nixon to appoint another special prosecutor to replace Cox. Congress would become more interested in what happened at the Watergate complex in June of 1972. And there is Cox, and there is the guy who took his place, Leon Jaworski. November 5th, Nixon appoints. Now, why is the president appointing a special prosecutor to investigate him? Never understood it. Should have been Congress, but that's what happens. Jaworski would secure a unanimous Supreme Court decision that would force Nixon to release secretly recorded tapes from the Oval Office in July 74. Also, one other problem taking place in the Nixon White House. Problem's called Spiro Agnew, a guy who Nixon really never had much use for. In fact, Nixon in 1968, when he was running for president, wanted Vince Lombardi, the Green Bay Packers coach, as his running mate because Lombardi was retiring. They found out Lombardi was a Democrat and that Lombardi supported desegregation in Green Bay. In fact, he was the guy who probably desegregated Green Bay back in 1959 when he got there. But he stumbles on Agnew, a Republican moderate governor from a border state, Maryland, who supported the civil rights movement, yet made a number of tough on crime speeches. The Agnew problem, here he is being sworn in in 1969. Nixon didn't like Agnew. He didn't give him any responsibility. But you could say the same thing about Dwight Eisenhower, who didn't trust Richard Nixon as vice president and gave him no responsibility. In fact, Nixon had so much no responsibility that when the Washington Senators baseball team was playing games during the day, my friend Bob Wolf did the Senators games. He was telling me that Nixon would go to baseball games. And one day he said to Dick, he said, "Why don't you join me in the booth? You're here anyway. Why don't you talk about baseball and WRC with me?" And Bob had about 25 recordings, 25 games of Nixon, the vice president of the United States, just hanging out with him, calling baseball in the 1950s. Agnew thought there was more to be. There was more to the job as vice president, but there wasn't really much. He felt stunted and dissatisfied in the position. That red mark, somebody who wants to answer a question or, oh no, I think it's me. Conservatives wanted somebody other than Nixon. Republican, because Nixon was doing all kinds of things like EOE and EPA and push for universal health care, Title IX, all these things. 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. And the conservatives were going crazy because Nixon's doing the liberal agenda. So they wanted to stop it because Nixon was doing it. Roe versus Wade as well. So the Republican, John M. Ashbrook of Ohio, mounts a campaign against him. All because he supported liberal and social economic policies, and conservatives didn't like that. So they got John Ashbrook. Nixon decides, you know what? I need the bulldog. I need the guy who's going out there who's going to bite. So Agnew's called back, goes out to campaign. Meanwhile, Agnew has got a problem in Maryland. George Beale starts an investigation in 1972. He's a United States attorney for the District of Maryland, and he opens an investigation of corruption in Baltimore County, including public officials, architects, engineering firms, and paving contractors. Beale's target was the current political leadership in Baltimore County. Agnew left Baltimore County, where he was mayor, in 1966. So it's just about the end of the statute of limitations. And there is Governor Spiro T. Agnew. Lester Matt's engineering firm was served with a subpoena for documents. It was revealed that Matt's had been kicking back to Agnew 5% of the value of contracts received through his influence. The first county contracts and state contracts while Agnew was the governor. And there is Lester Matz. In 1973, in June, Matz's attorney told Beale that his client could show that Agnew not only had been corrupt, but payments to him had continued into his vice presidency. Statute of limitations would not prevent Agnew from being prosecuted for the later payments when he was vice president. Oh, there's a very downtrodden Spiro Agnew. On August 1st, Bill sent a letter to Agnew's attorney, formally advising him that the vice president was under investigation for tax fraud and corruption. Matz was prepared to testify that he met with Agnew at the White House and given him $10,000 in cash. Jerome B. Wolf, head of Maryland's Road Commission, had extensive documentation that detailed, as Beale put it, every corrupt payment he participated in with then Governor Spiro Agnew. Carl Albert was the Speaker of the House, and Agnew was of the opinion that a sitting vice president can't be indicted. We're still going through whether or not the president or vice president today can be indicted. He met with the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, on September 25th. Investigated. And go back to John C. Calhoun, another vice president of the United States back in 1826. There was a House investigation of Calhoun, who was alleged to have taken improper payments while a cabinet member. I guess corruption reigned supreme 50 years after America became a country. Albert responded that it would be improper for the House to act in a matter before the courts. Two lovely guys, Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon. Agnew resigned on October 10th after the U.S. Justice Department uncovered widespread evidence of his political corruption, including allegations that his practice of accepting bribes had continued into his tenure as the U.S. vice president. So where is Richard Nixon? Here's a guy that Spiro Agnew went out on the stump to defend with his life. Agnew had to bargain with prosecutors to avoid prison, finally pleaded no contest to tax evasion. Judge did give him 3 years of probation, didn't send him to jail, fined him $10,000, and Agnew disappeared from the public view. He would never speak to Dick Nixon again. And there he says goodbye. Well, Agnew said to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a note, I hereby resign the office of Vice President of the United States, effective immediately. Gerald Ford is there, he's in Congress, and he's Nixon's selection to become vice president. Pursuant to the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, Nixon had to fill the vacant office of vice president by nominating a candidate who then had to be approved by both houses of Congress. Ford was easily approved. And there is Dick Nixon, and there is Gerald Ford. And that happens on December 6th as Ford is sworn in as vice president. The Yom Kippur War would end up causing havoc to the American economy. Starts in Yom Kippur, October 6th. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, taking the Israeli defense forces by surprise. And I mentioned Shelley Saltman at the beginning of this talk. Put down the phone, Shelley. His cousin Mutzi put together the Israeli defense forces in 1948. So there's two mentions of Shelley now. Syria struggled to throw the occupying Israeli troops out of the Golan Heights, while Egyptian troops swept deep into the Sinai Peninsula. And there is Anwar Sadat. He's the leader of Egypt. He's got to do something drastic because the Egyptian economy was terrible and they could not continue a war against Israel. They couldn't keep going. He wanted to make peace and recover the Sinai. But after the 1967 Israeli victory, it was unlikely that Israel's peace terms would be favorable to Egypt. So he threw the dice, started a war with the hope getting Israel to the table and getting something done and having a better treaty or get a better treaty than possible in 1967. So he conceives of a plan to attack Israel again, thinking it might convince the Israelis that peace with Egypt was necessary. The war presented a crisis of worldwide proportions, though it only threatened the long-time stability of the Middle East. But the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were heightened, even though Sadat threw out 20,000 advisors from Israel, from Egypt, from the Soviet Union in 1972. War itself. Here's where the goals: Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Reclaim land and prestige lost as a result in the 1967 war. Remove Israel's superior bargaining position dependent on the occupation of 1967 conquered lands. Force Israel into negotiations from a position of relative weakness. As Golda Meir, the old Milwaukee school teacher, who once said to some head of state, sit down, you're not as important as you think. Anyway, Israel's goals: maintain lands captured in 1967 to preserve ideal negotiating position with respect to Arab states, PLO, and other Arab Palestinian groups. Maintain superior combat effectiveness over Arab enemies in the face of being extremely outnumbered by Arab forces. Cannot strike preemptively in order to not appear to be the aggressor because they don't want to lose Nixon's support. And here's the map. That's where the war took place in October of 1973. When the Fourth Israeli-Arab War begins, many of Israel's soldiers were away from their posts, observing Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Arab armies advanced with their up-to-date Soviet weaponry. Iraqi forces soon joined the war, Syria even received support from Jordan. After several days, Israel was fully mobilized, and the IDF forces began beating back the Arab gains at heavy cost to soldiers and the equipment. And there is Richard Nixon, White House lawn with gold in my ear. U.S. airlift of arms aided Israel's cause, but Nixon delayed the emergency military aid for about a week for Egyptian eyes only. We're kind of supporting you too here. On October 25th, an Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire was secured by the United Nations. And there is Anwar Sadat. Egypt again suffered a military defeat. But the initial Egyptian successes greatly enhanced Sadat's prestige in the Middle East, gave him an opportunity to seek peace. There is al-Assad and Sadat. Al-Assad's family is still running Syria. They've been there since 1969, although there was a coup in 1963 that al-Assad was a part of. For Syria, another disaster. The unexpected Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire exposed Syria to military defeat. Israel seized even more territory in the Golan Heights. Okay, now what? Now what? We had another war. What's next? On October 19th, 12 OPEC members agreed to embargo and stop selling oil to the United States and its allies. And that would cause all oil prices to rise and would also have you in line for gasoline. For OPEC, the last straw came when the United States supported Israel with a $2.2 billion package that Israel could use against Egypt during the Yom Kippur War. Oil as a weapon, gasoline shortage, sales limited to 10 gallons of gas per customer. And I'm sure some of you are old enough to remember that. Arab oil producers cut off exports to the U.S. Prices went. I remember I was driving one day and the price went from about 31 cents a gallon on Route 17 in New Jersey to 57 cents a gallon overnight at the Power Test gas station. And it would contribute to a major economic downturn in the United States. That's Lower Manhattan near the Holland Tunnel. That gas station is still there, believe it or not. And there is one of the lines. Meanwhile, there's another civil rights movement going on in the United States. It's called the American Indian Movement, or AIM. It started in 1968, and it started in an area pretty close to the George Floyd area with Derek Chauvin. Starts in Minneapolis as an effort to protest police harassment of Indians in Minneapolis. Activists went to the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1973, and there were numerous problems with the Ogallala tribal chairman, Richard Wilson. And there is Dennis Banks, along with Marlon Brando, right? Yeah, that's Marlon Brando. No, that's not Marlon Brando. That's Dennis Banks, yeah, with Marlon Brando, who supported the American Indian Movement. And she recently died a couple months ago. Apache Sacheen Littlefeather, who accepted an Academy Award on behalf of Marlon Brando at the 45th Academy Awards, which almost caused John Wayne to beat everybody up in sight. She endured booze, mockery when she took the stage in 1973 to reject an Oscar on behalf of Marlon Brando and The Godfather, and a call for better treatment of Native Americans. Oh, you don't mess with the Duke. You don't mess with the Duke at all. He is really upset. He is so upset, he's ready to beat up everybody. Marty Picetta, who directed the Oscars from 72 through 88, told the Chicago Tribune, John Wayne wanted to go out there and physically yank her off the stage. It took 6 men to hold him back. Wayne reportedly said if Brando had something to say, he should have appeared that night and stated his views instead of taking some little unknown girl and dressing her up in an Indian outfit. John Wayne, a couple of years earlier in Playboy, talked about how blacks were not ready to assume role of leadership. There is Wounded Knee, 1973, February 27, 71 days of the siege began at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Federal officials and AIM members engaged in gunfire almost nightly. Hundreds of arrests were made. 2 Native Americans were killed, and the federal marshal was permanently paralyzed by a bullet wound. Wounded Knee shed light on the problems facing American Indians and showed them that they could have a voice. How many of you would use that mobile phone now today? Wouldn't use that at all. I mean, look at that. The guy is walking around with a mobile phone. And look at the other 2 people using those phones, which you don't see anymore. I mean, is it easier to use this now? Or is it easier to use that? Anyway, that's Martin Cooper. And he's the forerunner of people walking in the streets in Manhattan on their phones, not looking at anybody while they're walking. And you can hear their whole conversation. There's the guy. He's the first one who ever did it. April 3rd, he made the first public call on a hand cellular phone while walking down a New York City street. Of course, he's not the last to do it. There were people who are probably doing it right now in Manhattan. Anyway, how many of you had an MRI recently? I had one because I tore my retina. In fact, I got to go tomorrow for follow-up. So they put an MRI, on my head. Nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR. Let's start that again. NMR. The technology behind the MRI scanning is developed. On May 14th, Skylab, the first American space station, is launched. Secretariat won the Triple Crown. He was the first Triple Crown winner in 25 years. He won the Kentucky Derby, Preakness Stakes, Belmont, winning each race in record time. It's my father-in-law, and that's Billie Jean King. My father-in-law was a groupie in the 1980s because I would go to, this is the 21 Club. I'd go to all these places. He'd take his camera with him. And sometimes if you just show up looking like you belong, they think that you belong. And he used to show up with me. They knew me. And he looked like he was belong. He looked like an old-time guy. He had the plaid pants and all that other stuff, especially in the boxing world. They thought he was somebody. But he was really no more than a groupie who went out to meet famous people like Billie Jean King and have a meal on me, his son-in-law. Anyway, Billie Jean King. She a civil rights pioneer or not? Yes or no? Oh, yes. Anybody out there in Zoom world want to type anything in? Do you think she's a pioneer or not? She is. She is a pioneer. The Battle of the Sexes. The Astrodome in Houston, Texas, where Howard Cosell was on ABC. It was a spectacular September 20. I knew Cosell. I'm still friends with his grandkids, Colin, Justin. Colin's the New York Mets PA announcer. Justin runs a charter school in Stamford, Connecticut. And Jared is an ESPN lawyer and is a hockey coach up in Stamford. Anyway, on September 20th, the Battle of the Sexes. 30,000 fans filed into the Houston Astrodome with celebrities like Salvador Dali mingling with what appeared to be aliens wearing tuxedos. Billie Jean King was playing tennis for the women. She was defending women. And Bobby Riggs, he's going to show that men are superior. And that's my friend Shelley Sultan. He was the promoter of the match. And Shelley was beaten up by Evel Knievel. Remember Evel Knievel back in the day? Evel Knievel, he was Evel Knievel's manager after the Snake Canyon thing. He wrote a book about what a bad guy Evel Knievel was. And he was the president of Fox Sports in 1970s. And Evel Knievel came into the studio, baseball bat, beat the hell out of Shelley. Shelley got $13 million in judgment, never found it. And I know he's listening to me right now. He once asked me, he said, after you die, what time zone are you in? So why, you going to call me? Anyway, but he's the guy who was behind the Battle of the Sexes. He was the guy behind the Cleopatra entrance. He goes to Rice University. It's 4 track and field guys, and he's got they're going to carry Billie Jean King in, and they carried Billie Jean King in. And he was the guy who found the buxomy beauty that were with Bobby Riggs, and found the pig that Bobby Riggs gave to Billie Jean King, Riggs Pigs. None of this is in that movie, by the way. King entered the playing court, the Cleopatra entrance, on gold litter carried by 4 shirtless members of the Rice University track and field team. Riggs came in by rickshaw. Shelley got the rickshaw. Flocked by his bevy of Bobby's bosom buddies. They exchanged pregame gifts. A baby pig for the chauvinist Riggs. A giant sugar daddy lollipop for Billie Jean King. And there they are. Somebody's got a question here. Let me see if I can take that question. Should have spent more time showing photos instead of cutting them so quickly. Okay. Anyway, let me I got to get rid of that one. Hold on a second. Okay. So in 2008, I was sitting with Billie Jean King, and we started talking about this. And I said, "What were you doing? Why'd you do this?" She said, kind of weird. It's really kind of weird. She said, Title IX had just been passed. And I thought if I didn't rise to the challenge, that people would roll back Title IX. And Title IX was not a sports law. Title IX was passed on June 23rd, 1972. It's an education law. And it assures that women had equal opportunity to college courses like men. Women in the 40s, 50s, 60s could be nurses, secretaries, teachers, but they couldn't be a doctor, they couldn't be a lawyer, they couldn't, only 7% of 7% of law school in 1972 were women, 9% were women in medical school. And Donna DeVerona, who's still lobbying to make sure Title IX is still there. In fact, she has a stamp put out. She was at the last year. There was a stamp put out about 50 years of Title IX. Told me they made a mistake, the people who are the proponents of Title IX, by throwing sports in there. They should have just said all women's activities, not specified everything, just women across the board. They threw sports in there, and that has caused a lot of problems. Remember, this is Billie Jean King's interview she did with me. Remember, Title IX had just passed. I really didn't want it to be weakened. I thought with Margaret Court, who played Billie Jean King, losing, it would be a good chance for some people to start jumping on the bandwagon to weaken Title IX. Hurt our tour, the women's tour, to hurt women's sports, the women's movement. And there she is. And she was against Bobby Riggs. Bobby Riggs originally proposed a male-female matchup to Billie Jean King, who he dubbed as the leading women's liber of tennis. Remember, back in those days, women's liberation was kind of a dirty word to some, or 2 words to some. King ignored the offer, but the Australian, Margaret Court, who had won 89 of her last 92 matches, was the leading money winner on the women's professional tour, accepted. On May 13th, Riggs easily beat Margaret Court. So why'd you do it? I don't know. She said, here I am. I accept it. Well, if I win, I beat a 55-year-old guy. If I lose, I lost to a 55-year-old guy. But she went ahead anyway, and she got a lot of money for it too. That certainly helped. And here's how it goes. So, it was a TV show. What it was. Riggs, I'll tell you why I win. I'll win. She's a woman, and they don't have the emotional stability. 29-year-old woman facing a 55-year-old man. She would win, but ultimately, it was little more than a promotional gimmick. And by the way, Riggs and King became really good friends in his declining years. Billie Jean King slipped him money. to help him through his declining years, Bobby Riggs. Oh, they went on tour, kind of. They were on The Odd Couple. The Odd Couple, Oscar Minasoy, and I'm not going to go through the whole episode, but apparently Oscar Madison became Bobby Riggs' indentured servant, and the way they got out of it was there was a table tennis match, Oscar and Bobby Riggs against Felix and Billie Jean King, and Felix and Billie Jean King won. Oh, November 7th, 1973, New Jersey becomes the first state to allow girls to compete in Little League Baseball. It ain't over until it's over. Let me get that. Hang on one second. There. Hang on. How many of you know this guy, Yogi Berra? He used to speak at his museum all the time between 2006 and 2011, 3-4 times a year. And he'd be at most of them. And afterwards, he'd pat me on the rear end. Good job, kid. Let's go in the back. That was the back room. Let's eat and let's talk. 1973. By the way, do you know that Yogi Berra has been quoted more times before lawyers before the Supreme Court than any other man in Supreme Court history? Ain't over until it's over. Among other things, if you see a fork in the road, take it. What time is it right now? Where do you want to be buried? Surprise me. If you don't go to somebody's funeral, they won't go to yours. Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore because it's too crowded, among other things. And if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Yogi Berra's New York Mets lose to the Oakland Athletics in the 1973 World Series. Ain't over until it's over is his prized quote, Yogiism. If you're expecting a huge story about this, you're not going to get it. It's 1973. And the New York Mets, there are a lot of players who are injured, an awful lot of players who are injured. Jerry Grote is injured, Tom Seaver is injured, but they're coming back in September. It's also M. Donald Grant is the president of the Mets. He gives them a pep talk. Tug McGraw was there. You got to believe, you got to believe, you got to believe. But the Mets are floundering, and it's September. But nobody's pulling away in the National League East. So Yogi's team still has a shot at winning the division. But it's not a great shot, and they can't lose. And they're at Shea Stadium, and they lose a game. Now, I covered the Mets for a long time. In the old room in Shea Stadium, there was a desk like this, and everybody would crowd around the desk, and the manager would talk. And after a loss, you could hear a pin drop. That's just the way it is. So not much is going on. And the late Mike Dyer, who died 2 years ago, late Mike Dyer is with the Long Island Press, rather. And he says to Yogi, "Is it over?" And Yogi responds, "It ain't over till it's over." It's not much of a story, but that's the story behind that. Toilet paper shortage. Johnny Carson generally was a blank slate. You didn't really know what he was thinking. He went up, did the monologue, sat down, talked to Ed, talked to Doc or Tommy Newsom, and then the guests were on. That was it. 1968, February 5th through 9th, Johnny Carson saw which way the wind was blowing in the country with the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, women's liberation, and he wanted to send America a message, and then he decided, no, I'm not, and Harry Belafonte sat in for him that week to talk about those issues. Martin Luther King was there, Robert Kennedy was there, Freda Payne, Dionne Warwick, Aretha Franklin, and Paul Newman, a host of others talking about the problems. But he didn't want to talk about the problems. But there was a problem that he did talk about inadvertently that caused a problem for a lot of people. The great toilet paper shortage. Harold V. Froelich, a Republican congressman from the heavily forested 8th District of Wisconsin, began receiving complaints from constituents that pulp paper was harder to come by. Froelich noticed some news reports of a tissue shortage in Japan. He investigated and believed the source of the claim was companies who were exporting more pulp paper out of the United States to avoid federal price tolls on domestic sales. Well, he issued a second press release on December 11th, this one focusing on the potential of not only paper, but one consumer product that no American could leave without. The U.S. may face a serious shortage of toilet paper within a few months, he wrote. We hope we don't have to ration toilet tissue. A toilet paper shortage is no laughing matter. I don't know, is it a laughing matter or not? Here's Johnny. On December 19th, night show host Johnny Carson made mention of the toilet paper issue story in his monologue. And that's all it took. Johnny Carson talking about toilet paper shortage. Stand up and just like Johnny. No, they can't see it. Of all the shortages we have, there's a gasoline shortage, he said. You know what else is disappearing from supermarket shelves? Toilet paper. Aha. Yeah, you can have a laugh now. There's a acute shortage of toilet paper in the good old United States. We got to quit writing on it. But I want to tell you, it's serious. I just saw a commercial where Mrs. Olson comes in with a shopping bag and the housewife says, forget the coffee, just give me the shopping bag. That's what happened. That's what happened around Christmas time, 1973. The shelves are empty because Johnny Carson said there was a toilet paper shortage. Millions of people cleaned retail shelves of the rolls. A store in Seattle ordered 21 cases, but received only 3, adding to the hysteria. One woman reportedly asking for toilet paper rather than gifts for her party. Stores tried setting limits of 2 to 4 rolls per customer. Others raised prices from 39 to 69 cents per roll, not to gouge customers, but to dissuade them from buying too much. Other paper products like towels and cups were in short supplies. There were even rumors a toilet paper black market had emerged where hoarders were offering rolls at a marked up price. America's most trusted man, Walter Cronkite. He's now in his 10th year as the most trusted man. He became the most trusted man in 1963 with the Kennedy assassination. He announced that the president was dead, took down his glasses, shed a tear, composed himself in Old Iron Pants. That was his nickname, Old Iron Pants, was back in the saddle. America's most trusted man. The toilet paper frenzy continued into 1974, but eventually consumers realized Froelich's concerns simply weren't materializing. Respected CBS broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite urged calm on his newscast and aired footage from the Scott Paper Company that demonstrated toilet paper was coming off the factory line without delay. This was a major issue. I don't even know if you remember it, but it was a major, major issue. 1973 legacy. Well, 1974, one of these guys wouldn't be there anymore. Nixon would resign as president on August 9th. Gerald Ford would pardon Nixon for his crimes. Why? He wanted the country to get back to normal. Ford would lose his presidential election campaign in 1976. Gerald Ford is the only person to ever be the president and vice president of the United States without ever being elected. Sadat would eventually push for peace with Israel. He'd get that, but would be gunned down in 1981. Larry O'Brien became the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, retired in 1984, February of 84, matter of fact. There is Spiro T. Agnew and his wife taking a look at the bust of Spiro Agnew, one-time governor of Maryland. Agnew would fade away. America would face other gas and energy problems. Yogi was fired in 1973, but became a beloved icon, or actually 74 he was fired, but became a beloved icon thanks to Yogiisms. Billie Jean King is a civil rights pioneer, but her profile was lessened because of palimony suit with Marilyn Barnett, who tried to kill herself because Billie Jean King left her. There was no toilet paper shortage. People walk down the street on the phone today and nobody gives it a second thought. And there is Woodward, and there is Bernstein. They were reporting on the corruption of Donald Trump's presidency nearly 5 decades later. Mark Felt was identified as Deep Throat 2005. He was a former Federal Bureau of Investigation Associate Director. The former baseball player played with the New York Yankees, also the San Diego Padres announcer, and a guy who I knew. I always called him Lieutenant Colonel. He said, get out of here. No, you're Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Coleman. And he was talking to me about John Wayne one day. I don't know why, but it got into John Wayne. And he was comparing John Wayne to the great baseball player and war pilot Ted Williams, who he flew with in Korea. He said to me, Ted was everything John Wayne tried to be on film. He was a great film presence, but as we've learned, he was a horrible person. In August 2022, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science apologized to the Native American activist and actor Sacheen Littlefeather almost 50 years after she was met with disrespect and harassment as she declined Marlon Brando's Oscar. She recently passed away. There would be peace in the Middle East. Jimmy Carter, Begin, and Sadat. 1974, first of two Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreements providing for the return of portions of the Sinai to Egypt signed. In 1979, Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the peace treaties. June 24th, 2022, Supreme Court ruled against Roe versus Wade and took away a woman's right to choose, undoing all the work of activists. They threw it to the states. It's over. It ain't over until it's over, but it's over. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? The floor.